Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the City Club of Central Oregon. Today's program is Wildfire, the Human Cost of Disaster. My name is Blair Garland, Senior Director of Community Relations and Marketing at OSU Cascades, which is City Club's community partner and education annual sponsor. And I'm also honored to serve this year as your City Club Board President. I'd like to take just a moment to thank our other annual sponsors, and without their support, we would not be able to bring our community together for important conversations such as this. And even in this challenging year, our annual sponsors have continued to step up and support City Club because they care deeply about our community. So please, let's give a virtual round of applause to our platinum sponsors, St. Charles Health System and Brooks Resources, our gold sponsors, ASI Wealth Management, Pacific Source Health Plans, and First Interstate Bank, our partner in higher education and workforce development, COCC, and our silver sponsors, Ameriprise Financial, BBT Architects, Kittleson and Associates, Miller Lumber, Mosaic Medical, the Lucier Center, Transformation Systems International, and US Bank. Today's forum sponsor is Sunwest Builders. Here's what they had to say about their sponsorship. Sunwest Builders is privileged to be a sponsor of City Club's March Forum. We appreciate the respectful, nonpartisan environment and the dialogue created from diverse perspectives on important issues affecting our community. As Central Oregon continues to grow in undeveloped areas, the conversation of wildfires is an important topic of discussion. Today's live stream is also made possible by our partnership with Connect Central Oregon, a nonprofit launched with the assistance of the OSU Cascades Innovation CoLab. Now, as you know, City Club fosters civil conversations about the issues that matter the most in our community. But to do this, we do need your support. Your investment in City Club, whether that's a membership, a sponsorship, or volunteering your time, it's really about civil productive conversations, and it's really about helping our community be the best that it can be. Now, we've all watched as our nation's had challenges over this past year, and it's clear that constructive dialogue is needed now more than ever. So please check out our website at cityclubco.org for more information about how you can be involved. So today's forum will be a mix of facts and figures, codes and mitigation measures, along with socio-economic impacts of post-wildfire recovery, which cannot be underestimated. We hope you take away some actionable steps that you can take to help mitigate your risk. So now let me introduce today's moderator who will help guide us along this journey. Ben Gordon is the Executive Director of Central Oregon Land Watch. Previously, he served as Program Director for Oregon Natural Desert Association, Outreach Coordinator for 1000 Friends of Oregon, Field Organizer for the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, and taught forest ecology for the Opal Creek Ancient Forest Center. Ben holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Colorado Boulder. Ben, I pass the microphone to you.
Blair, and good afternoon, City Club attendees. As Blair mentioned, my name is Ben Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of Central Oregon Land Watch, an organization that for more than 35 years has worked to defend and plan for our region's livable future. Core to this mission is keeping our communities safe from the impacts of wild and home ignition fires. I separate these types of fires intentionally. Wildfires, like the Beachy and Holiday Farm fires that burned more than 1 million acres in Oregon last year alone, though they've been more severe due to a changing climate and weather patterns, are part of the state's fire-adapted ecosystem. Fires become more concerning to us when they reach our homes and businesses. So while wildfires are going to persist, where we locate our communities, the building materials we use, the defensible spaces we define, and our fire response infrastructure will determine how well our communities stand up to them. Each of these components has an associated cost, and so too does the aftermath of a home, or worse, a community when it burns. So how do we reconcile these costs? We've heard from developers that using fire-hardened building materials adds thousands of dollars to the price of a home, that establishing defensible space by removing vegetation from around the perimeter of a home is expensive and laborious, that we can solve our region's affordable housing crisis by building more homes in the rural areas that lack adequate road infrastructure to facilitate speedy fire response. And yet we know that the cost, both monetary and emotional, associated with a home that burns is exacting. So how susceptible are Central Oregon's communities to wildfire and home ignition fire, and what can be done to reduce our risk? This is part of what we'll discuss today. Today's panelists play a major part in shaping the policies and codes that seek to keep Central Oregon safe from fire and, when things don't go as planned, provide the support and resources needed. First, you'll hear from Haley Rich with Deschutes County Sheriff's Department, who will share a bird's eye view of the long road to recovery from the loss of property to fire. Next, you'll hear from Nick Lilac, Deschutes County's Community Development Director, about efforts at the state and county levels to manage development and building standards in areas most prone to fire. Then you'll hear from Doug Green, Fire Inspector with Bend Fire and Rescue, about efforts being undertaken by the City of Bend to reduce its risk from home ignition fires. All the while, you want to track the conversation and prepare your questions for the end of the panel when we invite question and answer. Before we begin our presentations, a little expectation setting. So with such a broad-ranging topic and so little time to cover it, there are many topics and subtopics we considered but decided to leave out. If you find yourself wondering why we left out certain germane issues like forest management or increases to insurance premiums after a fire, know this is why. So enough from me, let's hear from our panelists. First up, allow me to introduce Haley Rich. Haley had the privilege of serving the North Central Washington community as a disaster case manager after the fires of 2014. She met individually with survivors to support their full recovery and was involved in many other aspects of the disaster recovery efforts. She's been interested in helping build resilient communities ever since. Haley is an emergency services coordinator with Deschutes County Sheriff's Office. She works hard to engage the people and entities most impacted by disasters in emergency management work. Welcome, Haley.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so I'm Haley, and Ben mentioned I work for Deschutes County Sheriff's Office Emergency Management. I want to start by saying thank you for having me, and thank you for listening today. And I also just want to acknowledge that I feel honored to be a part of this panel with Ben and Nick and Doug. And I want to bring awareness to the fact that we are using Zoom and YouTube video, and the very nature of this call means that we are benefiting from a certain level of privilege, and not everyone is able to access information in this way. So here's a little shout out to my teammates, Sergeant Nathan Garabee and Ashley Volts. In the next 15 minutes, we're going to cover a lot of ground. I'm going to share a little bit about what happened in North Central Washington. We'll talk briefly about how communities and people are impacted by disaster. I'm going to try and give us a baseline of understanding of what disaster is to work from today. I'm going to share with you why I think we should prepare. I'm going to talk about a project that we're working on at the Sheriff's Office, and then I'm going to wrap up with some ideas for how you can help protect our communities. Most of the photos in this presentation were pulled off the internet. Some of the photos were provided to me by survivors with their explicit consent to share. I took this photo not half a mile from my house in Twisp, Washington on July 18th of 2014 as the Carlton complex fire was blowing up. I'm going to share a little bit about how this disaster affected us. The Carlton complex started as 4 separate lightning fires and then merged into one. At that time, it was the largest fire in Washington state history at 250,000 acres. We lost 2 civilians, 353 homes, and there were millions of dollars in damages estimated. This was a true disaster. Our fire, police, medical, and utilities responders were overwhelmed, and neighbors became the first responders. This is a quote from a Holiday Farm fire survivor. I'm going to read it to us. I'm glad I know my neighbors. More importantly, I'm glad I have good relationships with them. When disaster hit, we became interdependent in ways I couldn't imagine. The handful of deputies and fire crews were absolutely heroic, and they should be credited with saving numerous lives. But more lives were saved by neighbors checking on neighbors, helping people gather and run. So Okanogan County is located in North Central Washington, and you can see from this progression map that the fire made its biggest runs in one day on July 18th. That's the dark blue color on this map. This is not unlike the Oregon wildfires of 2020. This incident, the Carlton complex fire, affected multiple communities: Twisp, Carlton, Methow, Pateros, Brewster, Omak, Okanagan, again, similar to the Oregon wildfires of 2020. And this kind of severe, quick, and widespread destruction makes both responding to the disaster and recovering from it really challenging because your neighbors are unable to come to your aid. The Carlton and Okanagan complex fires affected our livelihoods. The fire effects were devastating in some areas. We lost livestock and important wildlife habitat. We lost infrastructure, power, water, communication. Our neighbors in Lane County are still struggling with communication loss. The Carlton complex fire burned over 350 homes, and people suffered. 44% of these losses were uninsured losses, and 56% were insured. And although people were insured, the majority of these folks were underinsured, and we'll touch just very briefly on that topic again later. Later that summer, we were hit with mudslides resulting from the fires and road closures. And then just when we thought we were on our way to recovery, the Okanagan complex fire started in the summer of 2015 and replaced the Carlton as the largest fire in Washington state history. Although our systems were a little bit more dialed, we were still caught off guard. These fires burned over 500 homes. In total, around 800 buildings and thousands of acres were lost. So although each community is different and has different strengths from which to recover and different challenges to overcome, many of the themes you just heard in the North Central Washington story are probably sounding familiar. Oregonians are living parts of this story as we sit here and listen. So how are communities and people impacted by wildfire? Major disasters like the Oregon 2020 wildfires often affect multiple and interconnected systems, which means recovery can be very complex. For instance, housing. Loss of inventory exacerbates existing housing challenges. Rents increase and population migration becomes a reality. Infrastructure, communications go down and are difficult to repair. Fires can destroy infrastructure services such as water and power, and towns lose the ability to pay staff and personnel. The preliminary damage assessment for repairs to public infrastructure for the Oregon fires was validated at over $52 million. Debris removal and hazard tree removal is expensive and challenging. And the state of Oregon's initial estimates for debris removal are $897 million. The economy is affected. We are seeing this right now with the pandemic, so I'm not going to go into that. Health services, if we were to lose healthcare facilities, repairing those can take years, and it can mean that people have to travel for healthcare. The physical impacts of community level trauma still are not fully understood. Our natural and cultural resources that we rely on so heavily here in Central Oregon. In North Central Washington, we lost valuable grazing land and then experienced a hay shortage. And loss of vegetation can cause instability and threaten public safety. Community planning, communities like Paradise lost much of their tax base. And social services and education, people's well-being is impacted by this community level trauma. Students can leave school districts because they have nowhere to live, and state dollars allocated on per student basis leave as well. So all of these systems and sectors are the web of our community, and all of these are impacted in wildfire disaster or potentially can become impacted. The state of Oregon is calling the Oregon wildfires a $1 billion disaster. I want to share this graph with you because I found it pretty accurate, and I wish I would have had it sooner. And although it depicts a macro view of the general emotional phases of disaster, survivors are individual and unique in their reactions. A few things to keep in mind: no one who experiences a disaster is untouched by it. And there are two types of trauma: individual and community level trauma. Stress and grief reactions are normal responses to an abnormal situation. And some of you may have experienced a similar trajectory over the course of this pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about individuals and families. Disaster case managers work our workers who come alongside survivors to support them in their full recovery. They ask, what does this person need to recover from this disaster in this community? So disaster affects people holistically, and rebuilding after a fire can be a huge project. This is just one example of a recovery plan from one of our clients in North Central Washington. And these are personalized. I asked if there was anything else he wanted replaced on or to add to his recovery plan, and he's asked for his marbles. This gentleman's housewarming party, this is party after his home was nearly complete, and we did gift him a bag of marbles. So the people who are most impacted by disaster are what we called our MVPs, our most vulnerable people. And although most people will recover fine, MVPs will need quite a bit of support. People on a low income and other marginalized groups tend to live in the most at-risk areas and are more vulnerable to negative impacts of disaster due to pre-existing factors and systems that may not be serving them well. And this is again a quote from our neighbor in Lane County. He says, "I'm stunned at how hard it all is. I miss my home and sanctuary every day, every holiday, every milestone. I miss all the little items tied to memories. I wish I had the house fully insured and that I'd updated it after the kitchen remodel." So disaster recovery is defined in a lot of different ways. So far, I like this one the best because it talks about pre-event planning and post-event actions. But really, disaster recovery and long-term disaster recovery is about healing and regrowth. It's about the strategies and resources a community taps into to survive and heal after an event. And I want everyone to know that recovery takes a really long time. People in the recovery world like to say long-term recovery is a marathon, but I experienced it as a series of middle distance sprints. It was really, really tiring for all of us. So why should we prepare for wildfire? We need to prepare for disasters, including wildfire, to reduce human suffering. Collective action helps reduce the impact on the entire community because not everyone is able to prepare. Some people are just working really hard to put dinner on the table, and probably the last things on their mind is defensible space, and that's okay. We need to prepare so that we can build back better. We need to put the work in now so that we can have a coordinated recovery effort. And preparing in advance helps us to reduce the high economic cost of recovery and leverage the resources that come into our community. So this statistic, each dollar invested in disaster preparedness saves $7 in recovery. I've heard this as high as $12 in savings to every dollar spent in preparedness. And this is a tough thing to nail down because each community is different. So there's different variables in how this happens. So planning for recovery. One of the things that we're doing at the Sheriff's Office is working to create a pre-disaster recovery framework for Deschutes County. We've been on hiatus because of COVID, but we're looking forward to focusing on this project again very soon. We know that plans can get dusty on shelves, so we're working to create a plan that lives in the hearts and minds of people, as my colleague Bob Stilger would say. We're using a collaborative and inclusive process that engages both the experts and the people who are most impacted by the decisions being made. So we're working with our MVPs to make sure that these plans work for everyone. So what can you do to help protect our community? I recently watched a video on COVID by Emma Chaput at COCC, and she mentions the Swiss cheese model for prevention. And I think that's a really great model for complex safety related problems because multiple layers are needed to keep our families and communities safe. There are many layers of the Swiss cheese of protecting our communities from wildfires. And I think Nick and Doug are going to talk about some of these layers, including some of the shared responsibilities. But I wanted to make sure and share some of the responsibilities that we all hold as individuals. One of them is just being a good caretaker, creating defensible space around your home. Knowing your neighbors is really important. Both myself and my community and our neighbors in Lane County experience that in a true crisis, your neighbors become your first responders. And I know that's really difficult during times of COVID, but hopefully we can all be back together very soon. Invest in homeowners and or renters insurance and update it on a yearly basis. Make sure that you are insured for what it would actually cost to rebuild your home or replace your items. And you need to check that every year, right? Because the market is changing so quickly. It doesn't cost much more to insure yourself for what you actually own. And it's also a good idea to just take video of your home and the contents once a year. Register for emergency alerts through Deschutes County so that you know what's happening in case there is a fire. You'll get notified to evacuate. And prepare a go bag and a 40-week kit, and prepare and practice a family emergency plan. So that's all I have for us today. And I just want to say thank you all for listening. And here's my contact information. You can probably get that from Ben and City Club at some point too. Oh, and I will also say, if you are interested in helping our neighbors, you can go to Oregon Community Foundation and donate there, or volunteer your time to help them recover. They're going to be working on recovery for years to come. So they need our help and support.
Great. Haley, thank you so much. Super helpful tips, very informative. So next we'll hear from Nick Lelak. Nick serves as the Deschutes County Community Development Director. He served in this position since 2012. Previously, he served as the county's planning director. Prior to that, with the city of Redmond as its planning director. And then before that, Nick held many other planning positions across the country. He also serves on the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Commission. Welcome, Nick.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ben. It's great to be here. And I've just started, I've just stepped away from a commission meeting to participate in this very important City Club conversation about the human cost of disaster. And my portion of this talk will discuss proposed code amendments for Deschutes County to reduce wildfire risk to property and structures. And I think this front page from our Ben Bulletin just a couple of months ago, 6 months ago, really captures the reasons that we need to consider these codes and many other protection measures very, very seriously. This touched so many of us so personally and closely, given that this is in our state. This isn't Northern California or Washington, it's right here. And this is a map that we have that we maintain thanks to our county forester, Ed Keith, and his team, showing the largest fires in our county's history over the last 120 years. And this illustrates clearly that our largest and most of our fires have occurred just in the last couple of decades. And it's important to point out that this just shows the largest fires. It doesn't show all of the small fires that are ignited and start across our county all the time. But thanks so much to our firefighters, fire districts, and others, most of those are extinguished, but clearly the hazard is very, very significant across our county. So I'm going to talk briefly about the background to developing our draft codes, where they would apply, the structures, the fire resistant building codes, defensible space, and then what are some of the next steps that we as Deschutes County are considering with these codes. So let's go back to 2015. As the county was creating, at that point, updating our natural hazards mitigation plan. And by the way, we're in that same process again now. Toward the end of that process, FEMA had some additional dollars left over, and they contacted our community development department asking if we would be interested in a review and an audit of our comprehensive plan and our development codes at the time. And we embraced that opportunity and utilized those funds to work with the University of Oregon's experts in natural disaster planning, preparedness, mitigation recommendations, et cetera. And they developed a series of recommendations for us. First, they found that we are far ahead of most jurisdictions nationwide, which is a great starting point. But they also had great recommendations on where we should go from here. So that process was completed in middle of 2015. In 2018 and 2019, we began at that point to begin to engage the state on some draft fire-resistant building code rules that they were considering. So we participated in that process for a couple of years. Then once they completed that work, our Board of County Commissioners directed us to create a diverse stakeholder committee of the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee to review both the recommendations from the code audit and the program review, along with other best practices that had been developed and practiced across the country over the past 4 years. We presented that final report to the Board of Commissioners just about a year ago. And then late last year, they directed us to then let's test those recommendations through a broader public engagement process, which we did through virtual town halls held and conducted by our Planning Commission. Hundreds of people watched and participated in that, as well as conducting a statistically valid survey. I'll provide a link here at the end of my presentation to a website that has all of these reports. So this is a background to how we arrived at the point we're at now. So let's first talk about where would the codes apply. Well, let's go back 2 decades. In 2001, our Board of County Commissioners adopted a wildfire hazard area for the entire county. And the purpose at the time was to prohibit untreated wood shake roofs. That was the only purpose we had at that point. So let's fast forward to today. So the state has adopted the new fire resistant building codes, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. And we have to, those codes will only be applied in areas that qualify as a wildfire hazard zone and map under state rule. And there are scoring criteria that we are required to utilize to determine where are the wildfire hazard areas in Deschutes County. And they focus on weather, slope, fuel hazard, and fuel distribution. And it would be an entire presentation just to talk about each of those scoring methodologies and how they were applied to the overall county. But this is a snapshot. And this shows that scores 7 and above, 7 to 12, are wildfire hazard areas in the county. And it's important to point out that as we look at this map, those areas that may not be red, they're still going to be in the 6 range. So if 7 and above are the wildfire hazard areas, other areas are very, very close to it. We had a long process with one of our committees to decide, should the entire county remain a wildfire hazard area and zone, or should we look at more targeted areas? And the committee was split. Last month, our Board of County Commissioners affirmed our current map. The entire county is going to remain a wildfire hazard area and map. And it's important to point out that it does not include our cities and their urban growth boundaries. Doug will talk about this in the next presentation in a few minutes. So cities will need to create the maps for their areas. And this map's going to be important. I'll come back to it here in just a minute. Before I do so, coming back to the map, let's talk about what the fire resistant building codes look like. So first of all, what is it? It starts with the State Building Codes Division. They adopted new rules just over 2 years ago to include increased construction standards for wildfire mitigation that can be adopted by local jurisdictions. And this is important because most state building codes we are required to adopt and required to implement across the county. This is one of the few where they gave local governments the ability, the option of whether or not to adopt these. So that's our first point, which is why we have not yet adopted them, and nor have hardly any jurisdictions across the state. They're intended to provide increased fire ignition protection of homes from flying embers and debris caused by wildfires. Now, it's important because the state adopted this code, and we have the choice of whether we're going to adopt it or not, but we don't have the choice of whether we want to pick elements from it that are more applicable or less applicable to our county or to various areas. We're required to adopt it as an entire code or not. However, they did provide local governments the opportunity to allow waivers for any lot property. There are a lot of opportunities for us to provide waivers. So if our Board of County Commissioners chooses to adopt this code through that process, we would need to decide what would be the criteria, what would be the area, what would be the circumstances where we as a community development department and building safety division, where we would allow waivers, if any. There is a cost to compliance. The estimates, there are a lot of estimates out there. It's between $0 and $6,000 or more to comply with the new rules and the new standards. And of course, there are a lot of factors that could determine the actual cost. The size of the home, the size of a deck, the location of the home, the availability of building materials. There are a lot of factors, but there is going to be a cost of some sort to comply with the new standards. Now let's go back to the map. The wildfire hazard map built into the rules by the state are some exceptions. And here's one really, really important exception. It's called the Infill Exception. And when I have in parentheses up there, no local control. Local governments don't have the ability to opt in or opt out of various areas of the county. The state rules state that R327, this is the new set of rules, only applies to new dwellings in subdivisions where fewer than 50% of the lots are built out. So this map excludes in the white areas of the rural county, all of those areas that are already built out at 50% or more. Well, this is the majority of rural subdivisions in Deschutes County. There are other properties where it would apply, but this is a very significant exception built into the rule. Another important exception is that if our Board of County Commissioners were to adopt this rule today, March 18th of 2021, there is a 3-year exemption for all existing lots. They would not need to comply. If they chose to build at any time between now and March 18th, 2024, they could do so without complying with the new rules. There's also another exception for non-habitable structures. So what features of a home would need to comply with the new fire resistant standards? Well, these graphics provided by Headwaters Economics provides a snapshot. It's pretty much all exterior features, roofing, ventilation, walls, decks, windows, doors. It provides a nice summary graphically to show where the new rules would apply for new homes. So let's shift gears from the structures to the properties. And Haley's already mentioned defensible space, as did Ben at the start. We'll talk more about this. So what is defensible space? Just so we're all on the same page, we all hear about it frequently. Defensible space, it is the natural and landscaped area around a structure that has been maintained. So that would be existing natural vegetation and or designed to reduce wildfire danger by using vegetation that is fire resistant. Now, the good thing is we already have some codes in place in Deschutes County. So this is not entirely new to us, whereas the building standards would be. We already require it in forest zones in the rural county, which is about 40% of our rural county, where defensible space is required for all new dwellings and permanent structures, as well as replacement dwellings. Somebody buys a house, they want to replace the dwelling, they're going to build a new one. The defensible space standards do apply to that new dwelling and property as well also to unprotected lands. And I'll show a map here in just a second that show what unprotected lands defensible space standards are already required in the rural county. I think it's important to recognize that we have over 40 fire-wise communities working to reduce the risk of wildfire in our county today. And most of that work is directly related to establishing and maintaining defensible space. So we have a lot of communities, from small neighborhoods to our resorts and beyond, that are doing a ton of great work already to establish and maintain defensible space across our county. So this is the map of where the defensible space standards apply today. It is just to the purple areas that you can see here on this map. These are the privately unprotected lands that we have in the county. So we're not starting from scratch here. We do have a starting point with county code with defensible space requirements. We also require defensible space in some new neighborhoods. These are a couple of neighborhoods on the west side of Bend, Tree Farm and West Side Transect, where as they've come in with community plans that we've approved in Deschutes County, very detailed defensible space plans. And it's important because these developers, property owners have been completely committed from the very beginning to protecting their structures, their people, our community of Bend. And at the same time, they've balanced a very challenging issue, balancing creating this defensible space while protecting wildlife habitat in this very important part of our community. Defensible space is generally broken down in 3 different zones. The first in the immediate area around a home, 0 to 5 feet. The next but up to 30 feet, and then the following up to 100 feet out. And there's various spacing for trees and shrubs and all kinds of things that occur within these various zones. And that would again be another presentation on what each of those zones might look like. Here's a great example. Again, thanks to Ed Keith and our county forester and his team, non-combustible material immediately adjacent to a structure where you see non-combustible materials. And here's an example of what not to do. Combustible juniper right adjacent, right next to a wood deck. So I just want to give you one example of what defensible space might look like. Now, when it comes to the fire resistant building codes, again, those are prescriptive by the state. And so we have a few decisions to make there. But when it comes to defensible space, we have a lot more decisions to make. Do we apply the regulations and or codes to all rural properties, or just to new development, or to certain properties with certain characteristics? So really important decisions to make there. Would property owners need to comply by a certain date, or would they be phased in over a period of time? How would we administer the defensible space standards? Would that be, for example, our community development department? Would it be something with in our county foresters department? How would we administer these new codes? And in addition, how could we do so in partnerships with our fire districts and or other organizations to educate and assist property owners, to apply for grants, which is very, very important to provide financial resources to help people establish and maintain their defensible space? How do we monitor it? There's a lot of questions that we need to address going forward. There's also costs for compliance here. The costs can be from $600 to $3,000 per acre, and that's a substantial cost to initially establish defensible space. And then there's an ongoing cost of $100 to $125 per acre to maintain defensible space. One of the challenges that we have is people will ask, well, what should I do with my property? And it's hard because there's not a one size fits all. In terms of landscaping, there's some general rules of thumbs. For example, don't put a wood pile right next to your home. But beyond that, when it comes to various tree species or shrub species or spacing or all kinds of things, it's really property specific based on the location in the county, the slopes, the size of the property. There are so many different factors that play into establishing defensible space. So next steps. First, our Board of County Commissioners are monitoring a number of wildfire hazard mitigation bills pending before the legislature. There are several, and they do a lot of things. Some have mandates for creating defensible space and or applying fire resistant building codes in the county, along with a lot of other requirements. Some come with funding, which is a very, very important factor. So next month in April, the Board of Commissioners will conduct a work session to both review the status of the legislation and the bills, as well as what we're going to provide with the Community Development Department. We're going to provide very specific maps of where the fire resistant building codes would apply. For more information on everything that I've just provided, we have some great links on our county's website. And as Haley mentioned, we assume that these will be made available to City Club and other members who are interested. I can't conclude my presentation without mentioning our fire-free yard debris disposal events coming up in the first couple of weeks in May at the Knott landfill, and then at our transfer sites in late May and in early June. So we hope people will participate and take advantage of that. I'm one person involved in this in our county. We have so many experts that we're happy to answer your questions. And really, if you hope to continue to track our code process going forward, please follow Deschutes County on social media. That's what will keep everybody up to date. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Thank you so much, Nick. Finally, we'll hear from Doug Green. Doug has been with Ben Fire and Rescue for 23 years, both as an engineer / paramedic and currently as a fire inspector and wildfire mitigation coordinator. Additionally, he works with the Sisters Camp Sherman Fire District as their fire life safety manager. He's also involved with wildfire mitigation consulting work around the country for Headwaters Economics out of Bozeman, Montana. Prior to his career in the fire service, Doug worked as a land use planner for the city of Bend and has a Bachelor of Science in Urban Geography from Oregon State University. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. So again, I'm Doug Green. I'm with the Bend Fire Department, and a big part of my job now in my career is really everything wildfire mitigation, wildfire resilient mitigation orientated within the city of Bend. And so kind of following what Nick was saying with the county, I'm kind of going to touch on what the city is doing to try to follow the same type of path in terms of making Bend a more wildfire resilient community. Really, our goal is to prevent, a natural disturbance, wildfire, from becoming a human disaster. So the fire department, we've known for a long time that Bend is at a high risk of wildfires. I mean, we live in a wildfire ecosystem. I think both Nick and Haley mentioned that. Wildfires have been, part of our ecosystem for eons and will continue to be so far into the future. And we know wildfires are getting bigger, they're burning longer, they're destroying more property and killing more people than they ever have before. And really everything we're seeing is showing that that's just going to be a continuing trend into the future, if not getting worse. And as a fire department, we understand that and we're prepared for that. We're prepared for the wildfires that I think most people assume would be coming from, say, the Forest Service land to the west of Bend, or from the BLM land to the east and south of Bend. Those big fires you would assume would be the wildfires that would threaten our community. But really, a lot of the things we prepare for are the wildfires from inside the city limits, the ones that start on vacant lots, the ones that start from an escape burn, fireworks, you name it. They can have just as devastating an impact on our community as the big fire coming from out of the area. So we view wildfires from both perspectives on that, and we are prepared as a fire department for both. And we know that once we kind of accept that we're in a fire ecosystem and that wildfire is a natural part of our environment, that we can plan for it and hopefully mitigate some of those damages from those. So Bend has had its share of wildfires in the past. In the 1990s, we had the Aubrey Hall fire and the Skeleton fire. Both fires destroyed dozens of homes and caused really widespread evacuations of the different parts of Bend during those fires. Most of you probably remember the Two Bulls fire in 2014. Again, that wasn't in the city limits, but just to the west of Bend, and had the winds been a little bit different, the impacts on possibly the west and north part of Bend could have been significant, and we could have lost dozens of homes in those fires had that wind been a little bit different. And even something like the Juniper Ridge fire in 2020, not a real big fire on the north end of Bend, but again, had the weather conditions been different and had not only our resources at Bend Fire, but our partners at the state and federal, their resources not been available at that time, and with a little luck, we were able to knock that fire down. And again, that had the potential to really have devastating impacts on some of our community members to the north part of this town. So, those are just a few, and I think Nick said this, of the hundreds of starts that really happen every year in and around Bend that we get knocked down before they turn into a potentially devastating wildfire. And so, we understand, and this is, I can't state this point strong enough. We understand this is not necessarily a wildfire problem. It's a home ignition problem. Wildfires are here. They're always been here, and they're always going to be here. But when you put a combustible fuel package, like a house, surrounded by combustible vegetation in front of a wildfire, you're going to lose that home and it's going to burn down. And that's really the problem. And it can be solved by reducing home and landscape ignitability. If you reduce that ignitability, you may not necessarily need to control that extreme wildfire to keep communities from burning down. We know we can't control extreme wildfires. They're going to go where they go. We can sometimes turn them a little bit. We can get people out of the way. But once they're burning, there's nothing we can do. And so if you put that combustible fuel package in front of it, you're going to lose that. And obviously homes burn down because they're built with and surrounded by flammable material. And the other thing too that is contrary to some popular belief is that it's not a fire inferno that comes in from the forest that usually takes out communities. Now, in some cases it is. Extreme fires can do that, but most homes are burnt down through embers. There's these huge ember storms. They throw, tens, thousands of embers in front of the fire, sometimes up to a mile in front of them. Those embers land on flammable vegetation. Those embers land on flammable parts of the home. Those catch on fire, and that's how you end up burning down communities. It's through ember storms like that. And we know how to solve that issue. The science has shown us how to solve those issues. So when those embers land on a home or a couple homes, usually at the outskirts of a community, and those homes ignite, those homes, again, are a combustible fuel package that produce huge embers, that produces a lot of heat. Those embers drop on other potential flammable vegetation on other homes. Then you get other homes burning, and that's how, again, you lose neighborhoods. When you get dozens of homes burning at one time, the fire department is out of resources. We cannot effectively fight a fire when there are dozens or tens of homes burning at one time. We get in there, we try to get people out of the way, and that's really all we can do. And again, that's how you lose entire communities, is when these embers start dropping on other homes and it becomes a domino effect that is uncontrollable. And like this picture shows in this slide, the homes are gone, but the vegetation is there. The vegetation is still green. You know, and you see this numerous times throughout the country after these wildfires where, again, it is not a fire front coming through that is taking out these neighborhoods. It is embers dropping on these homes, catching the flammable vegetation and catching their neighbors' homes and their neighbors' homes, and then you lose whole communities. Obviously, there's enormous physical, emotional, and like Haley said, economic consequences when you lose communities like this. And it can take decades when you lose water systems, schools, sometimes longer for these communities to even come back. Again, we know how to stop this cycle, and that's by building fire-resistant communities. And there's a lot of ways to do that. In 2016, Bend was lucky enough to be awarded the Community Assistance for Wildfire Grant. And it's an organization that comes in to different communities around the country, and they really do a comprehensive study of everything wildfire related in the city, from comprehensive plans to planning documents, park and recs documents, and they really look at what the community has and doesn't have for wildfire mitigation. They came, after about a year, they came back with about 5 recommendations. The number one recommendation they came back with was that Bend needed to develop and adopt a wildland urban interface regulation, or a WUI. You'll hear WUI a lot. That stands for Wildland Urban Interface. Bend is one of the few communities of our size west of the Rocky Mountains that does not have any type of WUI regulations that really guide us on how we can grow and develop into a wildfire resilient community. And that's one thing we're trying to change. Because of that report, because of the U of O report Nick talked about, and again, the increasing risk of wildfires to Bend, part of this Bend City Council's 2019-2021 goals was to develop a comprehensive wildfire resiliency plan. The City Council recognized that really all the homes within the city are in a wildfire hazard zone, and that we really needed to develop standards to ensure that the residents are protected from the destruction of wildfire to the best of our ability. Part of that plan was to put together a wildfire resiliency steering committee, similar to what the county did when they were looking at their options. We did that at the beginning of this year, and our task is to develop recommendations that we can bring to the City Council that reflect our values and priorities, and that the City Council can then make educated decisions, again, based on the priorities of the city, to make us a more wildfire resilient community. This committee is made up of a broad consortium of stakeholders, a lot of wildfire experts on there, folks representing the building community, Central Oregon Land Watch, and a lot of folks from our city development departments that really are the boots on the ground and how Bend is going to develop and grow and have the biggest impact on how we can do that safely. We're reviewing current language within the city right now and what we have on the books in terms of wildfire mitigation measures. We're also going to be looking at really lots of other communities around the country and what their WUI codes are, how they work, how they don't work, and really what we can bring back here to Bend that will work with what's important to us. The big thing we're waiting on right now, as I think Nick really talked about, is the state legislature is really tackling some of these big issues right now, especially with the fires last year in Oregon. We're waiting for them to kind of bring down some guidance for us, maybe some regulations we can use so we can move forward, use that as some traction to really put Bend on the right track to follow what the state is doing as a whole. We know Bend's going to continue to grow. We all know that the pressure's immense on Bend, on not only infill, but on growing outside what we currently have as city limits and urban growth boundary. WUI codes, wildland mitigation measures are not put in place to stop development or to slow development. We just want to use the best available science to build homes and communities that have the best chance of surviving a wildfire. And the science is out there. We know how to do that. It's just it's now a policy issue. It's really grasping what we need to do to make those changes. And again, the ultimate goal is to build a community that can not only absorb a wildfire, because we know it's going to happen. It's not if, it's when. But to anticipate a wildfire so a natural disturbance doesn't turn into a human disaster. So that's what I have. I'm going to pass it back to Ben, and I think we can move on to some questions from here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Doug. So we have 10 minutes left in this panel discussion. We have approximately 8 minutes reserved for question and answer. And just a sidebar here, we want to keep this conversation going. There will be follow-up emails with more information coming from the City Club afterwards. So if your question doesn't get answered in this short period of time that we have now, we will provide opportunities to circle back with the panelists and make sure that questions are addressed. So this is, to the audience, this is your opportunity to start submitting your questions. I have a few of them here that we will kick it off with. And well, let's follow up to something Doug said. Maybe he can expound on it a little bit. Doug, you mentioned the WUI and the City of Bend's need to adopt regulations about development in that area. Can you give an example from another city of what this could look like for Bend?
Yeah, sure, Ben. That's a great question. There's a lot of communities and cities that have developed WUI codes recently, and those WUI codes, again, I think Nick said that it's not one size fits all. There are communities that have just brought in landscape ordinances, landscape codes. There's other communities that have brought in the entire international WUI code that dictates landscaping, dictates how to build. I mean, there's overlay zones. And so there's cities such as Ashland has a real comprehensive WUI code that they've adopted. And WUI codes can mean, I've worked in communities where small communities like Wenatchee that have developed WUI codes all the way up to Austin, Texas, just adopted a WUI code for Austin. Same with Boise and San Diego. So the size of the community is not really a factor because there's lots of pieces of that WUI code we can bring in to make a difference, again, depending on what those communities need to help mitigate their risks. And so I think Ashland, if I was going to pick one that has done a really good job in not only their outreach initially, but a real comprehensive code that I think makes a huge difference to the public safety of that community, would be one I would have people look at to see to what it can entail.
Great. Thank you very much. Another one here that came in from the audience. Who is responsible for creating evacuation plans in the case of a large fire in Bend? And is there one?
Well, I think so nobody else is raising their hand right now to tackle this one. I'll jump on it. So that's a tough question. So evacuation plans are being developed at a high level. Deschutes County has done a really good job at already kind of looking at that. The sheriff's department is on top of that. And there's work being done right now in evacuation planning throughout the entire community, finding the best routes that to get people in and out, especially during the summer when we have such an influx in tourism. How do we get folks into places, out of places, especially people who aren't familiar with the area? So there's a lot of work going on right now in terms of evacuation planning. A caveat to that is that we're always a little hesitant to really put evacuation routes in place as a concrete thing, because fires change, they move, we don't know where they're coming from, and we don't always know where the safest route we want people to go to. And so we usually have a big overview of evacuation routes and plans in place, and then depending on the situation, depending on the natural hazard, we can bring those down to a local level and communicate that through sheriffs, through police departments and fire departments and our public works departments, and get people out safely. So that is a bigger issue, a bigger question, but there's lots of work being done right now, Ben.
Certainly, thank you. And this one, sort of a summary question of points that each of our panelists touched on. How do we mitigate wildfire consequences before they happen? And what are the steps we can take today?
Well, some of the steps we can take today are certainly considering these new fire-resistant building codes and defensible space. Our county forester, Ed Keith and Boone Zimmerly, in his department, they are working with communities across Deschutes County, across the region right now to establish these, communities with the defensible space, helping them monitor, maintain defensible space. They are just constantly applying for federal and state resources to help pay for that work. That is expensive and very, very important. So I think it's a comprehensive approach of steps that we need to take.
Great.
And to follow up with Nick's real quick. Oh, sorry, Haley.
Go ahead, please.
I think, yeah, it takes all that, and it takes a lot. And I think Nick touched on this, a lot of personal responsibility. And I think Haley said that earlier, that each individual's critical to that, because if your house doesn't burn, then you protect your neighbor. So not only the overhead regulations, like we've talked about, but each individual person can make a huge difference.
Yeah, and I would just second that, Doug and Nick, that there are multiple layers of this and multiple ways that we need to take care of our community. And really, for folks who are listening out there, we mentioned a bunch of different kind of individual actions that you can take, and really just take one, take two. It could just be a few things that you do. You might not be able to do all of those things that we mentioned, but you can try and tackle a few of them.
Great. It looks like we have time for perhaps one final question. I know this is a little bit out of the scope of each of your presentations, but if you're able to, describe the backup power systems in place to provide necessary firefighting infrastructure, such as power and water, in the event that fire disrupts our grid.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm certainly not an expert on that. I know there's a lot of high level discussion on that. I'm not sure if that question is based on what the infrastructure would be like if we lose a fire. Obviously, and Nick may follow up on this, one of the things we look at from the fire department and also from our natural hazard mitigation planning work is we view power systems, just like a lot of other critical infrastructure, as a critical thing. And we look at ways of protecting that, whether from wildfire, how do we get the vegetation around there. We also have been working closely with our power companies locally on, like they've done in California, how do we shut those down in case of high winds to keep those fires from starting? So I think, I don't know if I've answered that question, and Nick may follow up some more on this, but I know there's work being done to try to not only keep power and protect those lines, but also turn those lines off in case we have weather systems to keep those from burning.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And this certainly exceeds my expertise in this area, but my hope is that our pre-preparedness disaster planning will address this issue very specifically, the very process that Haley was mentioning that we started just over a year ago, and then due to the pandemic, we've needed to suspend until now that we all get back into being able to participate in those discussions again. But in addition to wildfire and the power systems and water supplies, clearly the recent storms in Texas demonstrate our need to have all of these systems in place, because it's not a matter of if this happens, we know it's going to be a matter of when.
Great.
And I might add a little something there too, going back to taking responsibility. We do just need to plan that if we were to experience something severe and acute here in Deschutes County, that we might lose our communications and some of our infrastructure. So folks who are vulnerable, who are on oxygen, if you can, create a backup for yourself. One thing that I did living in North Central Washington and experiencing fires every summer was just have a little inverter that I could plug into my car, because vehicles use fuel pretty efficiently. You can plug that in, charge your cell phone, charge one other item. So that's just one way that you can take care of yourself and reduce the burden on the rest of the community.
Great, thank you. Well, clearly an hour is not enough to adequately cover this complex and interrelated topic. So City Club will be sending out an email of resources as a follow-up, so be on the lookout for that. So to wrap things up, A thank you, a big thanks to today's speakers, Haley, Nick, and Doug. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to participate in today's program. Thank you also to Craig Letts, Daisy Lehman, and the other program committee members who helped with today's program. Remember, if you enjoyed today's forum and would like to help support City Club, please consider becoming a member or live stream sponsor at cityclubco.org. Turning to next month's forum. So next month asks how we as a region can envision better aging and how our region can adapt to the needs of an aging population. The world's population is aging at an unprecedented rate. Here in Central Oregon, the population of adults over the age of 65 is forecast to grow by 55% from 2016 to 2040. So how can we create an age-friendly community? Think housing, transportation, lifelong learning, intergenerational workforce, and inclusive social connection. Who are the older people in our midst? What roles can our local cities and nonprofits take in facilitating an age-friendly region? What can individuals do to prepare for better aging? Tune in to learn about growing older better in Central Oregon. To hear about this and more, please be here next month. Our April forum is at noon on the 15th. Thank you for watching. Please continue to cultivate conversation about issues that connect us all to build a strong community. Have a great day. Goodbye.